The governor calls it an occupation. The president calls it justice. The people on the ground, they call it a war zone. Today, we're in Minnesota, where a federal immigration raid has killed a woman in her SUV, a second shooting just happened amidst tear gas and street clashes, and the mayor says the city has been invaded. Not by a foreign army, but by his own federal government.
If your feed is full of thumbnails screaming, "Civil War has started," that is the backdrop. But what is actually happening on the ground is something different and honestly, much more alarming.
It's not a war. It's the slow, agonizing breakdown of how law and order is supposed to work in a democracy.
So by the end of this video, you'll know what really happened on these raids, why Trump is now dangling the Insurrection Act over Minnesota like a weapon, and what civil collapse actually looks like from the outside.
Including from up here in Canada, where we are watching our closest neighbor use immigration policy like a battering ram.
Let's start with the spark. The name that should be at the center of all of this is Renee Nicole Good. On January 7th, with the snow on the ground in South Minneapolis, 3 ICE officers surrounded an SUV a few blocks from Renee's home. She was 37 and a mother of 3.
Bystander video, which we've all seen by now, shows one officer ordering her to open the door and grabbing the handle. The vehicle backs up slightly and then starts to move forward. Standing in front of the SUV is Agent Jonathan Ross. He raises his weapon and fires several shots at close range. The SUV keeps rolling and slams into parked cars. Renee is hit right in the head and is killed.
Before any independent investigation even starts, before the state can even get its bearings, the machine in Washington snaps into position. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem calls it self-defense. Vice President J.D. Vance backs Ross publicly. Trump goes further and labels Renee a domestic terrorist.
Her family, her neighbors, and pretty much everyone in Minnesota see the same video we all did. A woman in a Honda Pilot, boxed in and panic-stricken. Whatever you think of the details, terrorist is a word designed to shut down sympathy and justify anything that happens next.
Later on, a DHS official quietly told a reporter that Agent Ross had internal bleeding after being struck by her vehicle, but they gave no clear timeline and no medical details.
Well, I call bullshit on that because we saw him clearly walking away.
Casually, like nothing happened. This feels less like clarity and more like they were hurriedly retrofitting a story onto footage the whole world had already watched.
Officially, this whole surge is supposed to be about cracking down on fraud in social services programs, particularly targeting Somali American communities. But in reality, the governor says it right out loud. This long ago stopped being about a matter of immigration enforcement. He calls it a campaign of organized brutality against the people of Minnesota by our own federal government.
ICE and Border Patrol agents are everywhere. Mayor Jacob Frey says his city of 600 officers is now having to deal with roughly 3,000 federal agents on its streets. That's a 5-to-1 ratio. His words are, they have invaded Minneapolis.
Frey holds an emergency news conference and doesn't mince words. He says ICE and border officers are creating chaos, not safety. He talks about what that looks like in real life. Cafes closing because staff are afraid a relative will get grabbed, parents scrambling because the schools are going virtual, residents calling 911 because masked men are banging on doors and dragging neighbors away.
He calls their conduct disgusting and intolerable, which it is.
Terrified residents are begging for help. His own officers are drowning in ordinary 911 calls, and the federal search force doesn't answer to him, doesn't share his priorities, and has made it crystal clear that they're not slowing down.
At the same time, reporting from outlets on the ground say agents are invoking Renee's death directly, telling protesters that they'll learn their lesson like she did. Disgusting.
Then comes the second shooting. North Minneapolis. Federal officers stop a driver from Venezuela. DHS says he's in the country illegally. They claim he flees, crashes into a parked car, and then runs. When officers catch up, they say 2 people come out of a nearby apartment, and all 3 attack an officer with a shovel and a broom handle.
The officer fires and hits one man in the leg. DHS calls it a defensive shot. The city confirms the injury isn't life-threatening, but the visuals are ugly. Smoke in the streets, federal officers in gas masks and helmets firing tear gas and throwing flash grenades into small crowds who are just throwing snowball and chanting our streets.
This isn't a one-off. Scenes like this have become common, is how one report puts it. People see agents yanking individuals from cars and homes. They see bystanders screaming at them to leave. They see masked officers whose badges they can't read, whose chain of command they don't understand, making life or death decisions in their streets.
And into that chaos steps Trump with the ultimate threat, the Insurrection Act. He has spent days deriding the state's Democratic leaders, but he also went after the residents themselves, calling the local Somali community garbage.
That is the rhetoric of dehumanization. And on Thursday, he escalated it to a military threat. He posted that if the corrupt politicians of Minnesota don't stop the professional agitators from attacking the, quote, patriots of ICE who are only trying to do their job, he will invoke the Insurrection Act to quickly put an end to the travesty.
Historically, the Insurrection Act is used when local leaders ask for help, like in the riots of '92. Here, the president is threatening to deploy the military against a governor and mayor who are begging him to leave.
And remember, he has already sent nearly 3,000 federal officers into the area. They're walking on icy streets in camouflage, faces hidden, carrying assault rifles. They're being met by residents banging tambourines and blowing whistles. And Trump's response is to threaten to send in the army to crush them.
Governor Walz calls it what it is, a threat against a state that voted against Trump 3 times. In a primetime speech, he said that what is happening defies belief. He pointed out that Trump has been promising a day of retribution and reckoning online aimed at the people and the states that oppose him.
He also describes armed, masked, undertrained ICE agents going door to door, ordering people to point out where their neighbors of color live. It pulling people over indiscriminately, including U.S. citizens, and demanding to see their papers.
He asked Minnesotans to carry their phones at all times to film everything and to help create a record. He told them that accountability is coming in the voting booth and in the court.
But for local leaders on the ground, decency, it's not enough anymore. Minneapolis City Council member Robin Walmsley went on CNN yesterday and absolutely tore into the governor. She told him to stop talking and start acting.
She called on Walts to demonstrate an ounce of courage and declare an immediate eviction moratorium so people can shelter in place safely while ICE is hunting in their neighborhoods. Her point was brutal. Strongly worded statements or strongly worded letters to the administration are just simply not sufficient.
She warned that residents are protesting with huge courage, but that energy isn't being matched by the people in charge. She laid down a gauntlet. If elected leaders are not going to show up in this moment to protect and care for our neighbors, we will.
And in the middle of all of this, the Indigenous communities of Minnesota are getting hammered again. Jose Roberto Ramirez, a 20-year-old Native American man and a U.S. citizen, he got dragged out of his aunt's car in a suburb by masked ICE officers. Video shows his aunt screaming that he's a citizen, but the officers, they don't care.
So then his mother spends hours trying to track him down. She eventually learns he's being held at the Whipple Federal Building at Fort Snelling, the same land used during the Dakota War of 1862 to imprison Indigenous people. When he does finally come home, his back and neck are all marked up and his hands are cut from the cuffs.
Leaders of the Oglala Sioux tribe say 4 of their members have also been detained in the surge. That's despite being U.S. citizens. They call it what it is, racial profiling and a violation of treaty obligations. We are the first Americans, their president says.
And here is the real kicker. When federal officials hint that tribes should sign cooperation agreements in exchange for more information about their detained members, tribal leaders refuse. They won't become ICE's auxiliary on their own land. One lawmaker sums it up perfectly. Using members of the tribe as pawns in micromanaging or emotionally manipulating tribes is abhorrent.
While this legal and political war rages, everyday life is wobbling. Hundreds of students walk out of schools in St. Paul, marching in sub-zero wind with slogans saying, "Love melts ice," and "De-ice Minnesota." They're teenagers who should be worrying about exams, not whether federal agents are prowling their bus routes.
The University of Minnesota, with 50,000 students, announced that some classes will move online because violence and protests have come to our doorstep.
So where does all of that leave the Civil War narrative that we mentioned in the beginning? You see it in every headline, in every comment section. People feel like the country is breaking apart.
Local officials say the situation defies belief. The president calls residents terrorists. Federal officers tell protesters to learn their lesson. Democracy gets reduced to a backdrop for a street fight.
The real story here is not whether a war has begun, it's whether there is enough institutional strength left in courts, in state houses, in communities to pull this back from the edge.
Now, from up here in Canada, watching all of this, the alarm bells are ringing at the highest levels. It's not just us watching the news. Manitoba Premier Rob Canoe confirmed he officially reached out to Governor Walts this week to voice solidarity. He said that he offered whatever assistance Manitoba could provide to our neighbors.
That is a Canadian premier having to call a U.S. governor to offer support because the U.S. federal government has gone rogue against them.
Now, for Americans, that should be a mirror. This is what happens when a federal government decides it's above all accountability. When law and order becomes an excuse for calling whole communities garbage and turning neighborhoods into battlegrounds. If you're watching from Minnesota, we want to hear from you. Tell us, does this feel like a system under stress or something more? Are you afraid to go outside? Are you protesting? Or does it feel like business as usual in your neighborhood? And if you want to support independent media that isn't afraid to call this what it is, consider joining the A-Team. Your memberships are what keep this channel independent and allow us to cover stories like this without corporate pressure.
We also do deep dives on Substack, and we keep the conversation going daily in our Facebook group, so check out the links in the description below.
So thanks for watching, everybody. Take care of each other. The people paying the price for all of this are rarely the ones giving the orders. See you next time.
Ciao for now.